Hi everyone. Today I'm going to talk about hate crimes against Asian Americans and the Pacific Islanders community in the United States and racial diversity and justice issue. It's a heavy topic, but it's very important. As an Asian woman, it's really close to my heart, and I wanted to share my thoughts on this. And this month, we are celebrating AAPI Heritage Month. It's a good time for us to become more aware, more informed, and more involved in a racial justice issue. Up until I left Japan in my 20s, my identity was simple. I was Japanese. What I didn't know when I moved to the United States was that I would be gaining many other names, labels, and titles such as foreigner, permanent resident, immigrant, Asian, Asian woman, Asian minority, woman of color, foreign born immigrant, ethnic Japanese but not Japanese American. I didn't ask for these labels, but they pursued me. I believe my sense of identity was solid, but now I'm not so sure. These labels are objectively true and not insulting. I'm proud of being a woman, Asian, Japanese, and there's nothing wrong with being a named minority or immigrant. But I do not particularly care to be defined by those names or limited by label of others' making. But why? The question was lingering in my head for years, but I never thought it through. I didn't realize why until the recent news of horrendous murders of 8 people in Atlanta, 6 of whom are Asian American women. According to the report by Stop AAPI Hate Reporting Center, there have been 6,600 incidents of violent and public attacks against Asian American reported during 1 year leading up to the Atlanta shootings. Since the onset of COVID-19 pandemic, widespread rumors over the source of virus and former President Trump's use of racial slurs like China virus and his anti-China rhetoric played a major factor in normalizing and spreading hate against Asian Americans. Although anti-Asian hate and scapegoating of immigrants is nothing new, this horrific incident in Atlanta was a wake-up call for me. What is it about Asian Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders that makes them susceptible to being targeted? After conducting my own research and reading, and also attending seminars related to the topic, I was shocked to discover some perspectives and root causes of the hatred that I wasn't aware of. Here are some of those findings. First off, what characterizes anti Asian racism is it is based on xenophobia, which is a fear of strangers or someone who is different from us, bigotry, which is intolerant devotion to one's own opinion and prejudice, and hate. These ideas stem from general perception of Asian Americans and historical stereotypes such as being quiet, passive, hardworking, and so on. While there's some truth to those characteristics, there are three key concepts that often define the reality Asian people face, and which are critical to understanding Asian culture, history, and backgrounds. Number one, invisibility. Number two, perpetual foreignness. And number three, cheap and marginalized labor. Today, about 20 million people in the US trace their ancestry to somewhere in Asia, making up approximately 6% of the entire US population. California has the largest Asian American population in the US, accounting for 13.6% of California's total population. Asian Americans accounts for 1/4 of all immigrants who have migrated in the United States since 1965. Asian immigrants are now the fast growing racial group and the largest foreign born population in the US, with currently about 60% of Asian Americans being foreign born. Despite the increasing population and their growing presence in many corners of our society, Asian Americans still remain largely invisible. That's because the public often perceives Asian Americans as being quiet, passive, and weak, and also because of the model minority label that Asian were given. Asian invisibility has a strong association with the history of the immigrants to the US as cheap labor in the mid 1800s, when they were regarded as the lowest caste amongst all immigrant groups. Asian invisibility is graphically represented by the photo taken at the celebration of the completion of Transcontinental Railroad on May 10th, 1869, when the two mighty locomotives from east and west met at Promontory Summit, Utah. None of 20,000 Chinese immigrants who had risked their lives to brass granite and break through the Sierra Nevada by hand were included. They were invisible, and the role that the Chinese immigrant played in building the Transcontinental Railroad has long been buried. What does model minority mean? It is used to describe those who come to this country and do everything right, who keep their heads down and work hard to make it without complaint. In many Asian countries, keeping quiet and being non confrontational is considered a positive trait. These attitudes can be observed in many levels of society, from children in a classroom to employees in the workplace, who are expected to listen to and follow directions without question. Similarly, in many Asian families, the youngs are expected to pay respect and refrain from speaking back to their parents and the elderly. Such character trait and a traditional moral is highly valued in their culture and also help to keep the group and the society in order and peaceful. This cultural trait, however, worked against them when it was brought to the United States and unintentionally encouraged others to take advantage of them. For example, when treated unfairly or with disrespect based on their race, Asia may tend to be quiet because they're thinking A, I'm afraid of confronting, or B, it can't be helped, I can put up with it. This sends an unwanted message to the perpetrators, not only allowing them to not be held accountable for their action, but also encouraging them to repeat the same behaviors without any confrontation or repercussions. Speaking up in English is not always easy, especially for a foreign born immigrant with limited language skills. They may feel shy and intimidated to express their opinion and are often afraid to make mistakes or to be misunderstood. They tend to stay within their own ethnic group where they feel most comfortable. This can further isolate them from the community they migrated to. Invisibility. That's number one. Asian Americans are often viewed as outsiders who don't belong to this country. Asian Americans are not uniformly represented across their population. They consist of total 19 major ethnic groups, with Chinese being the largest, followed by Filipino, Indian, Vietnamese, and Koreans, and Bhutanese being the smallest. These subgroups are diverse in background, education, income, religion, language, and poverty level. Despite the impression that Asian Americans are well educated, they are overrepresented at both ends of the spectrum when it comes to education and income. Nationally, Asian Americans are more likely than other Americans overall to be without high school diploma. Yet, they are also more likely to have four-year college degree. Politically, the Asian American community is still underrepresented at all levels of government. With limited affiliation with existing political parties, Asian Americans tend to identify themselves as independents because of long-standing stereotypes of invisibility and foreignness. Election outreach effort by the major political parties to Asian American community has been minimal. As a result, Asian Americans have had low voter participation rates. Their voter turnout rates hover at around 30% today, compared to 50% for general population. Taking leadership in the civic process to mobilize the community and to gain visibility and political power is a challenge and not a test for the Asian American community. So, perpetual holiness, that's number two. I recently attended the forum on Causes of and Response to Anti-Asian Violence through the MIT Center for International Studies. One of the presenters, Catherine Moon, a professor of political science at Wesley College, illustrated how the recent violent events against Asian Americans, especially Asian women, connect with international relations by taking us back to the wars that the United States has been involved in the 20th century. During that time, Asians became either vicious enemies, such as Japanese during World War II, communists in China, North Korea, Vietnam, and Laos, or those portrayed to be weak, poor, and helpless victims who needed to be protected and saved, like South Koreans, South Vietnamese, Cambodians, and Filipinos. According to Professor Moon, since the mid 20th century, Americans encountered more Asians on Asian territory than in the United States. Just to give you an idea, during the post-World War II, the US military has deployed somewhere between 130,000 to 180,000 troops in Asia Pacific regions, and it is maintaining that number today. Presence of large-scale troops has inevitably created service industries that caters the US forces around the bases in each country, including the sex industry. Many Asians, both male and female, were put into subservient roles such as cooks, drivers, shoeshine boys, and prostitute. Those US soldiers were very young, often teenagers or 20s, who had never left their hometown, landing in foreign countries where Asian they saw were local Canton people and serving them. Professor details, quote, as much as Asian governments has disliked and shifted the view of their countries as one large brothel, these governments are also responsible for having facilitated wide-scale sex industries. They used women's bodies to gain national security commitment from the United States, as well as to gain foreign exchange. Women themselves in Asia are often harassed, physically beaten, and assaulted in different ways from local police, traffickers, bar owners, US troops, pimps, the list goes on. Many egregious murders and unbelievably outrageous, heinous crimes took place in those compounds on women's bodies. Unquote. Of course, this is just one aspect of US military experience in those countries, but it is a reality that many Asian women had to deal with in Asia before they even come to the United States. And militarism in a historical and global context is a significant part of what created American stereotype of Asian nation, people, and women as being weak, passive, cheap, marginalized labor, and sex workers. These stereotypes, coupled with the collective perception of invisibility and perpetual foreignness, have contributed to xenophobia, bigotry, and hate, the root causes of anti-Asian racism, thereby making Asian people even more susceptible to discrimination and violence.